Welcome to the courtroom. On trial today is sexual assault and how we as a society are dealing with it. I'm very sorry to say that you've opened your letterbox and there's a notice summoning you for jury duty. Today, I'm inviting you to make a decision on 4 key parts along the journey that is sexual assault. It's up for you to decide what's working and, more importantly, what's not. It's up for you to decide if the path we're currently on to deal with this issue is the right one, or if we need to turn around and find another solution. Alright, pay attention. This is going to be important. Strong cases have strong facts, so here's a few. Fact number 1. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 25 men have been sexually assaulted. Fact 2. Of the people that report a sexual assault, around 50% of them will say that the person that attacked them was known to them. Fact 3. Of the sexual assaults that occur, only about 1 in 10 will ever see the inside of a courtroom. Have you got all that? Alright, we're going to go on to case 1. The case for culture. I think the best place to start is always at the beginning. So, where does this issue come from? What breeds it? I think the answer to that is simple. Culture and education. Sexual assault is a crime that's bred from a lack of understanding and a lack of respect. The more you're aware of this issue, the more places you'll see it. Social media is one of the places it's most obvious. In fact, social media is one of the places where I've noticed an alarming trend. People don't understand what sexual assault is. Largely, people don't understand what consent is, or who can give it, or when. Too often I've been trawling through a Facebook group and I'll see the same question pop up. I was at a party, I was drunk, I was making out with someone. I blacked out, I woke up in their bed. I'm not really sure what happened. Was I raped? And more concerning than this story always popping up was the comments that followed everywhere in response. Sure, maybe it was rape, but you can't blame the other person. Nope, sorry, your responsibility to not get that drunk. See, this is why no one ever believes us when we're actually assaulted, because people like you make up stories when they do something they regret. There is a chronic lack of understanding around what consent is. And rape culture is a big part of this. I think rape culture can largely be summarised as a combination of 2 big things: a lack of understanding about consent and a number of social factors, mainly normalised sexual aggression, a victim-blaming mentality, and the perpetuation of the myth that people frequently lie about being raped. This culture largely starts in high schools. It starts when students aren't taught that their drunk friend can't consent, no matter how enthusiastic they might seem. It starts when groups of students are on a train and they harass people routinely but are never pulled up for it. Think about your own high school experience. I know that for me, there was countless people I knew that had been assaulted at parties, but had to go back to school with the people that had done it. Rumours tended to circulate the cohort pretty openly about what had happened. I don't think it was ever addressed by their teachers. We were never given clear directives about what was okay and not. Our sex education never covered that. So, although mostly schools would tell you that they respect women, they have comprehensive sex education, and they don't tolerate harassment, even where that's true, do the scenarios I've described sound familiar? Are they things you recognise from your own high school experience? I'd like you to reflect for a minute on how much high school shaped who you are now. How did the social norms you learned there translate into your life today? How much of the person you are is shaped by your experiences as a teenager, at schools, from social events? The acceptance of groups of teens bragging about the person they slept with who was drunk on the weekend, or abusing people on public transport. That is the culture problem we have. That is the culture that breeds assault. And it's also the culture that normalises it. Earlier this year, there was a poll I came across, and it exposed the amount of students that had been assaulted by classmates. The part that disturbed me the most, though, was the amount of these people's peers who seemed to think that the victim was always at fault, even where that victim had been drunk, high, or passed out. It exposed how the culture of entitlement that our social breeds when paired with poor sex education, was leading to the perpetuation of this issue. Think about your high school. Think about your university. Think about your workplace. Have you ever been in a situation that you were uncomfortable but everybody else seemed to be laughing at? Have you ever experienced something that looked like sexual harassment but everybody else seemed to think it was okay, so you treated it like it was as well? It's decision time. Is our culture okay? Are you happy with our social norms? Do you understand what consent is? Are you confident that your friends do too? We're going to go on. Case 2. The case for the courts. I mentioned that strong cases have strong facts. So this time, it's a factual scenario. There's a person, they're in bed, nearly asleep. They feel someone come in and start touching them, but they're expecting their partner home, so they don't worry, and initially they respond to the touch. At some point during the interaction that follows, they open their eyes. It's a stranger. Is it rape? Did they consent? Could they? Now, let's suspend the illusion for a second. I'm not actually a lawyer, this isn't actually a courtroom. So I'm going to give you something that a real lawyer never should. I'm going to give you my opinion. I say that yes, it is rape. No, there's no way that person could have consented. And if we jump back into our courtroom, allegedly Victorian statute agrees with me. One of the specificities in the Crimes Act regards consent, and it says that a person cannot consent while asleep or unconscious. Despite this, in November of last year, the courts overturned a conviction in very similar circumstances. They ultimately decided that the perpetrator might have had reasonable belief that the victim was consenting because they had responded to the touch. In light of this, would it surprise you to know that less than 3% of rapes ever result in a conviction? Consent law is tricky. There's a lot of grey areas. In a he said, she said, there's very little a court can do but acquit. Guilt beyond reasonable doubt is a necessarily high standard in our criminal justice system. But this seems to me like one of the very few cases where it could actually just be black and white. They were asleep. They couldn't consent. So, did the courts get it wrong? Did the law? We're going to move on to another set of facts. A person approached the police, they'd been assaulted. The police told them that with the evidence they had, they could go to court and they would probably be successful. But they were also told that it would probably be about 18 months before they had a result. And that doesn't count any appeal processes that may happen. They ultimately decided that they wanted to move on with their life. They decided not to go through with the court proceedings. Do you think a justice system that is so arduous for people to get through that they just don't bother is a good solution? I think the courts are bound by two main problems. The first is time. There's a lot to get through, and for many people it's just not worth spending so much more of their life on what was one of its worst moments. The second is legislation. It's vague, and the nature of these crimes, in that they often happen in isolation, means that it can be very hard to adjudicate in a courtroom. It's over to your decision now. What do you think? Does what you think about both of these cases align with the decision that was ultimately made? And what of the courts? Would you trust them to get justice for you? We're going to go on to case 3 now. The case for legislation. I realised reasonably early on in my university journey that I thought there was kind of a problem with the way we dealt with sexual assault in the court system. But, naive new student moment, I thought there was a pretty easy solution too. Law doesn't work, change the law. It seemed logical. And to a certain extent it was. I'd come across the case of a nurse who'd been grabbed and dragged into an alleyway. She'd been pinned down and had a hand across her mouth when the perpetrator was finally chased away. The whole event was caught on CCTV footage. But the perpetrator got away. They convicted him only with common law assault. He was not convicted with attempted sexual assault. The courts ultimately ruled that it could not be determined definitively that the intention of his attack was to sexually assault her. The solution came from the Justice Party. They proposed what was called the grab and drag law reform. The idea of this is that it would bridge the gap between common law assault and an attempt to sexual assault, when the former didn't seem like enough, but the latter could rarely be proven. It seemed like a good solution to me, at first. But over to you. What do you think? Will more comprehensive laws work? Is a higher conviction rate or more punishment an acceptable way to deal with this problem? I'm going to offer you another opinion. No. Stronger laws don't help people who have already been hurt. And they certainly don't help the countless people that never come forward after they've been raped. Alright, we're nearly there. We're on to case 4 now. The case for education. I think we can recap our previous cases like this. We have a culture problem. It's not being solved by the courts or by policy. Here's where we need to make an adjustment to our thinking. In 2018, the University of Columbia conducted a study. They found that where students had been exposed to formal sex education that included refusing unwanted sex, they were half as likely to be assaulted. There's a really important lesson here. Comprehensive sex education doesn't just stop people assaulting others. It teaches potential victims that they're allowed to have boundaries. It teaches people that they can expect their boundaries are respected. That's not at all to say that all the responsibility should be on victims. Not at all. Because just like this sort of education reduces the likelihood of being victimized, it also reduces the likelihood of being a perpetrator. I think there's 2 main things we need to be doing with sex education. The first is teaching comprehensive consent education. People need to know what consent is. Through practical, situational-based learning, we can make sure there is no scenario where a person can say they were unsure about consent. Perhaps more importantly than this though, we need to be tackling the cultural cause of this issue. It's well observed that education is the way to make cultural change. In fact, one of the big advantages of doing an arts degree is that you produce more tolerant, empathetic graduates. That's mostly because people are exposed to other people's lived experiences, and it allows them to have more empathy for those people. I think that similarly, the way to tackle the cultural causes of sexual assault are to expose people to other people's lived experiences. We can teach respect. We can teach a more acceptable social norm. We can't deny that there is a cultural problem at this point. And so rather than just ignoring it, we need to actually be addressing it. Schools are the crucible for sexual assault. When you combine that pack mentality that teenagers have with a lack of proper education, we see a cultural issue that goes from schools into sports clubs and workplaces and ultimately into homes. But when we teach about consent and respect, we do see cultural change. The more we talk about sex and personal agency, the less likely we are to experience an abusive dynamic. We're already seeing the benefit of where people respect others and refuse to accept what has been a social norm for so long. In March of this year, we saw tens of thousands of Australians reject a culture that has seen it be okay for people to be harassed in workplaces and abused at home. The March for Justice was an example of the power of respect. The March for Justice showed us what happens when people demand a cultural change. There's a path that we seem to be on to dealing with sexual assault. Legislators want to introduce policy that will see more convictions and harsher punishments. We've already changed statutes. Instead of rape, which focuses on the sexual element, we now have sexual assault, which focuses on the violence element. But that's not doing anything to combat the fact that based on numbers alone, sexual assaults have been rising. And don't forget the amount of people that will never report the fact that they've been assaulted. I'd like you to visualize for a moment sexual assault as a road with 3 stops. The first, where we learn cultural norms, but we don't learn consent. The middle, where assaults happen, a fraction of them are reported, and a smaller percentage of those ever result in a conviction. And then we've got the end, where policymakers try and change the law so that more people end up punished. But do we want to be tackling it at the end of the road on that 3rd step? Or do we want to go back to the beginning, where it all starts? Schools are a part of this, but so are you. Education is everyone's responsibility. We have phones and the internet right at our fingertips. There's resources everywhere. We have to be teaching ourselves as much as we are focusing on teaching other people. We have to be learning about consent. We have to be calling out social dynamics that are inappropriate all of the time. The day in court is nearly done. But before you go, I'd like to remind you of something. Your job doesn't end with jury duty. Your job doesn't end. It begins here, but it follows you every step you take out that door. You might recall something I said at the start. It's okay if you don't. I know it was a little while ago. The best place to start is at the beginning. The best place to start is with education. I'm going to ask you to make a decision one final time. How strong is the case for education? Do we want to be dealing with this problem at the end? Or do we want to turn around and deal with it back where it begins? In the case of education, how do you find